I'm Carl King, and this is the Carl King Podcast, where every week we learn about music, filmmaking, and the other creative arts. To support this podcast, head over to patreon.com/Carl King and join for just $1 or $5 per month. Or send a tip through PayPal or Venmo to username Carl Kingdom. Special thank you to my illusionist $51 level patrons, both Hank Howard III and Cabo Wetch. Quick shout out to my music endorsements, Vienna Symphonic Library, Fractal Audio, Ernie Ball Strings, Tune Track, and Millennia Media. Now, let's get this episode beginned. Very good friends of Carl King, today's episode is a very special episode about my creative busyness in 2022. But before that, to make sure everyone is feeling their best, let's start with some thoughts on seasonal depression. Some of you may know that I have battled depression throughout my life, which comes and goes in cycles. Sometimes it's related to a creative project not succeeding, or feeling that no one likes me, or sometimes it's just seasonally related. It can get really bad and give me a super negative outlook on life. And I started to feel it setting in a couple of months ago as winter began, and this time I fought it off. Now, the two most important things have been, one, staying physically active. Depression has a low energy effect, and that low energy and low activity is like an exponential spiral. It makes me want to stay on the couch and sleep random hours and take long naps, which lowers my energy even more. The remedy has been forcing myself to wake up early, aiming for 6 a.m., but sometimes later. And I fight that depressive resistance by simply moving my body. It's an exercise of willpower, even though I don't believe in free will, but I try to go on a couple of walks every day, about a mile or a mile and a half each at sunrise and at sunset. As a last resort, if my schedule gets all messed up, I'll even go after dark. It doesn't even matter where I walk. I'll even just go back and forth on my street for 30 minutes, if that's what it takes. And number 2 is intermittent fasting. And I do believe I have an eating addiction, for real. Food is the one thing in my life I will use as a drug to try to fight anxiety. Like if I have a ton of video production work and don't want to do it, I'll feast on a ton of carbs, burritos and cookies and pretzels, to the point of feeling sick. And it becomes far worse as winter sets in, which I'm guessing is some kind of evolutionary thing. So I've recently taken on this whole intermittent fasting practice, and for me that means eating only one normal meal a day at lunchtime around 1 p.m. And then I try not to eat anything again until the next day at 1 p.m. The one exception is a very small nutritional mixture of athletic greens, hemp protein, and wheatgrass powder, which is only a total of about 150 calories. It's very light, and it seems to get me through those 23 hours. Intermittent fasting has done 2 things. Number 1, it's kept me from getting into that cycle of severely spiking my blood sugar, which causes food fog and sleepiness after eating a massive amount of carbs, and then getting even more hungry as my blood sugar crashes, continuing the roller coaster of overeating. And I had previously been eating big meals like 4 or 5 times a day. And 2, simply being hungry and having to deal with or accept it is another workout for my willpower. If you can overcome hunger, you can overcome a lot of other things. If I were to give in to those urges and lie around on the couch and eat burritos all day, that's exactly what sends me into the depression. So beating that this year has been a major accomplishment. And hey, as a bonus, in the past 2 months of this, I've lost 10 pounds of non-desirable fat from random parts of my body. So let's dig into today's very important episode. As I'm sure all of you know, each year, independent musicians and filmmakers and writers and so on are required to meet certain standards of output. Now, these standards are established by an entity known as the World Bureau for the Measurement of Creative Busyness and also Random Length Lumber. According to Wikipedia, the current bureau took over in 1977 after an international incident forced the Bavarian Illuminati to relinquish control of the markets for both creativity and random length lumber. So, according to the rules, I need to earn enough annual creative busyness units, or CBUs, for my account to remain in good standing. And I definitely don't want to be in bad standing, because if my membership were to become into bad standing, I would not be allowed to be creative anymore. It's sort of like a FICO score for creative people. Now, each project an artist completes and releases receives a certain number of those creative busyness units. And for the year 2022, I need to reach 661 points minimum to remain in good standing. And the highest possible is 941 units, which would be a perfect score. Now, the only entity to have ever reached a perfect score was the Travelers Insurance Companies of Hartford, Connecticut, who issued a red 7-inch record for the 1964 World's Fair called The Triumph of Man. Anyway, today I'm going to go through all of my projects from 2022, add up all of my creative busyness units, and see if I will be allowed to be creative in 2023. So let's start with the progress of this very podcast. According to the rules, the audio and the YouTube versions count as a single project. But before we calculate the number of creative busyness units, let's go over all the details about the Carl King podcast. Going back to June or July, I restarted this podcast for 2 reasons. Number 1, it was a way to directly keep in touch with my audience. Like, hey everybody, I'm still here and making things. Otherwise, it feels quite isolated, and I do enjoy some level of interactivity. And number 2 was to generate financial support for my creative projects. But there is a third benefit, and this wasn't intentional. Doing this show every week keeps me on a pretty strict schedule of thinking and writing. As Monday approaches, I'm forced to come up with content. And while sometimes it's stressful, it's been a positive challenge. So here's an overview of what I did. Every week since July 7th, I've put out a new episode, and they get published every Tuesday at 4 a.m. Pacific, unless something bad happens, and then they're a few days late, like today's. Anyway, this is my 26th episode since July 7th. And since my 2 main art forms are filmmaking and music, often combined, it was an easy choice to do film and music reviews or analysis, with the occasional motivational or demotivational essay. If you listen to some of the older episodes, like maybe episode 18 or 19, you'll hear how freeform they were. And that's because I was improvising based on a rough outline, which meant lots of starting and stopping, thinking of what I was going to say next. But there was something that bugged me about that. To stand out from most podcasts out there, I would rather share fully formed thoughts. Like if I review a movie, I want to take the time to process it. Like, what did I learn from it? And what can I share with other filmmakers? Not just that typical, it was good because I liked it, because it was good, because I liked it, because it was good. Way too many podcasts are opinion-based. So if I give my opinion, I want it to be clearly marked and separate from objective measurements. So in those earlier episodes, you'll hear statements like, "This movie was crazy," and not knowing what else to say. And to me, that sort of commentary is worthless. Like, why was it crazy? You should dig deeper and get technical. Was it the writing? Was it the camera motion? Was it the editing? Tell us why this detail or character or dialogue or plot deserves attention. So I reviewed somewhere around, I'm guessing, 35 movies in that style, sometimes 2 or 3 a week. And some of my favorite films this year were X and Pearl from Mia Goth and Ty West, and also Barbarian by Zach Cregger. Those 3 films excited me, and it seems to me that style of horror is where powerful craftsmanship is happening. Extreme twists, hard contrasts in structure, and plain old surreal fun. And there was also Crimes of the Future from Cronenberg, which I loved. And my rewatch of Big Trouble in Little China gets an honorable mention as a colorful, silly movie. So if I had to name my top 5 films that I saw this year, they would be possibly in this order: Pearl, Barbarian, Crimes of the Future, X, and Big Trouble in Little China. Now, I also wanted to depart from and de-emphasize the typical podcast interview format. And this is because, honestly, I'm worn out on giving everyone else the spotlight. And that might sound selfish or self-centered, but let me explain. I've spent a major portion of my creative energy supporting other people's projects, helping other people make movies, promoting everyone else's ideas, and sort of being the technical guy in the background. And maybe part of that was fear of taking responsibility or fear of my own ideas being unworthy. And I decided, you know what? I'm going to put Carl King up front as much as I can from now on. And it's not because I'm at the core seeking praise or fame. It's because I believe it's a good long-term investment. If creative work is like farming, then I have been an excellent farmer, but working on farms that are not owned by me. So whatever I produce, the owners put their names on it and sell it. And I have been paid well for my work. But after a lot of years of farming, you realize it's maybe not the best deal because the owners can decide to sell the farm or shut it down at any moment, and you stop getting paid because you don't own it. So this podcast is an investment in building my own farm in the meantime and putting some of the spotlight on me, Farmer Carl. At first I felt like, well, maybe it's egotistical. Like, why should I be in the spotlight? Why me? Well, why not me? So here I am. But I did want to make room for the occasional interview episode, so I did release 4 this year. 2 of them were lost episodes from years ago, virtuoso pianist Lalle Larson and the 7-string guitarist Pete Peterson. And also 2 new episodes, Tim Smallins of Astratosphere and Trevor Dunn of Mr. Bungle. And I also cleaned up and released the very first episode of the Carl King podcast with my favorite musician in the world, Steve Vai, which also got posted on the homepage of Guitar World's website. As far as segments of the show, I did some musical album or song of the week type reviews, and I alternated between film scores and complicated rock music. Some of my favorite artists like Steve Vai, Victims Family, Sleepy Time Gorilla Museum, and some of my favorite film scores like Star Trek by Fred Steiner. Now, thanks to my interview with Lalle Larson, the most exciting music I was turned on to in 2022 was an American-Mexican composer named Conlan Nancaro. You know those self-playing pianos you see in airports or malls? Well, they used to be in bars controlled by a big roll of paper with holes punched in it. And Conlan Nancaro thought, ooh, what if? And he hacked player pianos to perform impossible mathematical ratios based on frequencies and overtones. Anyway, his music is something that all composer types should at least be aware of. And if you're a fan of wild, noisy, mechanical, polyrhythmic piano shredding, definitely look into it. I'll put a link in the show notes. By the way, I added up all of the content of the Carl King podcast this year, and it's approximately 20 hours. So if you want to listen to me talk for almost a whole day straight, here's your chance. Now, I want to talk about the growth of the show in terms of listeners. It has been a slow, painfully slow process. And I've definitely had my moments of, why the F am I even doing this if no one's listening to it? But in all honesty, it is growing little by little. On Apple Podcasts, I gained 43 followers in these 6 months. And on Spotify, that number's bigger. I gained 64. As far as the other audio-only platforms, I don't know how many followers I have, but I have passed the 4,000 total all-time IAB downloads. And the most popular episodes have been episode 14 with Trace Bruins at 477 plays, and episode 34 with Trevor Dunn with 300 plays, and episode 24, Tim Smollins with 209 plays. Now, the least listened to episode this year was episode 8 with Greg Bissonette, and he got 15 plays. Folks, I have found it very hard to predict at all which episodes will get attention. So what do stats really tell us? We don't know yet. So now let's talk about the YouTube portion of the Carl King podcast. In comparison to the 43 followers I gained on Apple and the 64 I gained on Spotify, I gained 208 on YouTube. Now, for math nerds, that's 5 times what I gained on Apple Podcasts. My 5 most popular videos this year, in ascending order, are Trevor Dunn of Mr. Bungle with 1,461 views, Mark Borchart's Creative Advice with 1,778 views, Steve Vai got 1,859 views, and Urgent Message from Mark Borchardt got 2,276 views. But here's the biggest. How did Mr. Bungle write their music? 5,000 plus views. Now, this is far from the millions of views some people get, but it is definite progress, and I'm pleased with it, especially with most of these videos being audio only. And at this rate, my YouTube channel should be qualifying for monetization sometime in the next 2 to 3 months. Okay, so let's go ahead and calculate how many creative busyness units I get here from all this podcast work. 1? What? It says here that podcasts are always worth 1 total point, no matter how many episodes or how popular it is? Podcasts are stupid? Well, had I known that, we're not off to a good start, are we? Well, let's talk about our Patreon growth then. If you aren't aware, Patreon is an easy way for you to support artists, musicians, and podcasters with monthly subscriptions. And it is the main source of my creative income. My Patreon went from $46 in January to $186 in December. And members went from 13 in January to 27 in December. So membership has doubled in a year, and I think most of that is due to the podcast. Everything combined, from all of my own Carl Kingdom creative projects, I'm bringing in about $200 a month. Of course, I'm still spending more than that on things like music software and web hosting and whatever gear upgrades I need. So I'm hoping that this next year, that income will continue to increase and maybe even cover my costs. Okay, so let's go ahead and enter the numbers. Hey, 200 creative busyness units awarded for that. Nice. It says here it's based on Patreon membership percentage growth of 200%. I'm not sure the math is correct on that, but I'm not going to argue. Okay, so I am at 201 creative busyness units so far, which is pretty good. Now, moving on to the best of 5, the classic Tetris champions. Now, some of you may know I am involved in a 5-episode documentary series about the classic Nintendo game called Tetris. Director Chris Higgins hired me to help him co-write, edit, and score the music. And so far, I have rough scored around 20 scenes. I think it was something like 80 minutes of material. I've posted a lot of rough demos inside my Patreon, if you'd like to hear them. Now, we are nearing the completion of episode 1. I have a rough score in place, and Higgins is making more adjustments before locking the timing so that I can do the final score. Now, I don't know exactly when these will be released, but sometime this next year. So, let's find out how many creative busyness units I'm gonna get from this sucker. Hey, another 274 creative busyness units. Now we're up to 475. The explanation here says, 1 creative busyness unit awarded per cup of coffee you consume that is full of cockroaches. Okay, moving on to my animated shows. This year I wrote, recorded, and rough scored my new animated pilot, Dragontooth In. It's a half-hour show that's a cross between Game of Thrones and Cheers. It's a small ensemble of characters set in a single medieval location and stars Dan Foster and Stephanie Sutherland. And that project is just about to enter the phase of animatics while I work on the rest of the orchestration. And I look forward to releasing it publicly in the coming months. And also, you can read the full script and hear the demos inside my Patreon. While I was on a roll with the screenwriting, I also knocked out a sort of reboot/prequel to That Monster Show, explaining how the monsters came to be in Florida. And of course, the rough draft is available as a PDF, also inside my Patreon. Okay, so writing 2 half-hour pilots is an extreme amount of creative busyness. So let's see what 17 creative busyness units? Yep, it says right here that any amount of screenwriting, minimum of 1 word, is worth 17 points total. Well, now I'm at 492. Well, I'm not too worried because this next one has to be worth a lot. Related to all of that animation writing, I entered a bunch of writing competitions, and I can't remember how many total, but Dragontooth In was a quarterfinalist in 3 different competitions. The Script Lab TSL Free Screenplay Contest, the Stage 32 Sci-Fi Fantasy Screenwriting Contest, and the Screencraft Animation Competition 2022. So it was a quarterfinalist in those 3, and also a second rounder in the Launchpad Pilot Competition 9th Annual. And That Monster Show Reboot was also a quarterfinalist in the Stage 32 Sci-Fi Fantasy Screenwriting Contest. So that's 5 total accolades, I think they are called. Well, let's see what we get for this. 102? Who makes up these numbers? So writing the scripts gets me only 17, but entering writing competitions gets me 102? Well, that gets me up to 594 creative busyness units. And I'm most of the way there anyway. Hey, I also wrote a new book this year called Robots and Aliens, Deep Liner Notes, 1996 to 1999. And it's about 125 pages. It tells the story of recording my first Sir Millard Mulch CD in Florida. And it's got tons of original transcriptions, photos, and commentary on every song. It was also edited by my friend Chris Higgins, and that book is available only to my Patreon members. So let's find out the total on this one. 125 creative busyness units? Let's see, 1 unit awarded for each page. Huh. Now wait, that puts me over the number I need because I'm now at 719 creative busyness units. Folks, I might just be on my way to a perfect score of 941 if this keeps up. So look out, travelers insurance companies of Hartford, Connecticut. Moving on to some of my music re-releases this year. I remastered the first Sir Millard Mulch CD, 50 intellectually stimulating themes from a cheap amusement park for robots and aliens, Volume 1. And that one goes all the way back to 1998, as well as the first Sir Millard Mulch cassette from 1995 called Nice, Nice, Very Nice. And both of those are on Bandcamp and also available to Patreon members. And while I was at it, I posted an audiobook called How to Sell a Effing Audiobook, which I recorded in 2004. It's a collection of excerpts from the How to Sell the Whole Effing Universe to Everybody book. And that one is another Patreon exclusive. Okay, let's run the numbers for the 50 intellectually CD re-release. 49. Huh. Well, it says here approximately 1 point per song written in the key of C major. P.S. You should have listened to your music theory professor. Okay, whatever. Well, these are all bonus points anyway at this point. Okay, so we're at 768. Let's enter the Nice, Nice, Very Nice re-release. 4? Only 4? Let's see. 1 creative busyness unit determined by the width of the original physical medium rounded down to the nearest inch. Ah, cassette J cards are 4 inches wide. I should have done some kind of giant vinyl or something. Okay, that brings us to 772. And so let's find out about this How to Sell audiobook. 0 points. And no explanation here. It's just giving me 0 creative busyness units. Okay, well, no one listened to it anyway. Okay, now, as far as recording music, I did record 3 new songs in 2022. There was I Hate This Song. I hate this song, I hate. Can we turn it off now and check out something else and I'll listen to it all day long? I hate this song, I hate this song. The idea wasn't bad, but now I'm super sad cause they did it all fucking wrong. Bighand Bastard. Bighand Bastard. Bighand Bastard. Bighand Bastard. Bighand Bastard. What does she like? That's anyway. Uvula. And Friday, which is a cover of the Rebecca Black song. By the way, you can hear the Friday cover on all of the streaming platforms, but I Hate This Song and Bighand Bastard are Patreon only. Okay, so let's enter these in. I bet I'm going to get a good score here. Total songs recorded 3. What? I lost 708 creative busyness units? Oh man. It says here that 236 will either be rewarded or subtracted depending on whether the singer makes non-lyrical, genre-appropriate mouth sounds, which may include whoops or haze. Oh, I'm down to 64? But you know what? I can recover from this, because just last month in November, Steve Vai held a gigantic auction of his possessions. Guitars, amps, personal relics going back to his childhood. Well, I am now the owner of hundreds of pages of original handwritten personal documents created by Steve Vai himself. And it is unbelievable to me what I was able to get. And I plan to spend some time organizing and scanning it. And it's my intention to make a mini documentary or video podcast episode about it in the coming months. All right, this one's going to be big. And I know I didn't officially complete the project yet, but it's got to count for something. 12 creative busyness units. It says here that 1 will be awarded for each time you find a way to mention Steve Vai in casual conversation per day. I would think that number would be a lot higher then. But hey, I still have a score of 76. So let's move on to some other appearances. Here's something kind of cool. My favorite podcast is called Deep Questions with Cal Newport. And Cal actually answered one of my questions about social media and algorithms. And you can find it at 5 minutes into episode 195. Well, that's a pretty big podcast, so it should be worth a lot. 4? Just 4? Getting mentioned on your favorite podcast is only 4 creative busyness units? Cal Newport is the guru of creative busyness. Like, that's what his whole show is about. Oh well, it's more than I got for 6 months of work on my own podcast. At this point, I'm only at 80 creative business units, which means I might not be allowed to be creative next year at all. I guess I might just take a year off and, I don't know, learn more about random length lumber. But I was also the guest on the Twitch channel of drummer Mike Stone, where we talked creativity, music, and filmmaking for 3 hours. So let's see how many creative busyness units I get for that. 209? Wow, that's like 50 times what I got from the Cal Newport podcast. It says here, based on the percentage of color correction and aspect ratio stretching required during post-production. Seems fair. So where are we now? 289. Hey, I'm working my way back up. Okay, so let's look at some other videos I produced this year. Back in 2014, I shot an interview with Mark Borchardt. And I dug it up, and I was blown away by how good it was. So I released 2 versions, a short version called Mark Borchardt's Advice for All Creative People, and the full-length, nearly hour-long, The Wisdom of Mark Borchardt. And another was a short video trailer for my animated projects, also featuring Mark Borchardt, called An Urgent Message from Mark Borchardt. Okay, so let's enter those in. 73? Why only 73? Am I the only one who thinks this whole creative busyness measurement thing is kind of unfair? Because that is one of my most popular videos all year. It's so bizarre. But okay, that gets me up to 362 again. Well, this is the last thing I've got. I produced and scored 3 Ways to Help Ukraine, a collaborative project with Dan Foster and Chris Higgins. And we filmed it in my studio with Dan, and I will put a link in the show notes. So let's see. This one unfortunately only got 57 views on YouTube. I don't know why, what's wrong with people. So I doubt this is going to...
Success.
Whoa, 300? Well, let's see the explanation here. Any project involving Dan Foster is automatically awarded 300 creative busyness units. So wait, why did all that work on Dragontooth Inn only get me 17? Doesn't matter because this puts me at 662 total. Just one more than the minimum required. As usual, I barely passed. Folks, I think this means I get to remain in good standing and do more creative busyness for another year. That means no random length lumber for me. Now, what do I want to be doing with my own Carl King creative time in 2023? What do I want to accomplish? Well, I can think of at least 5 projects. Well, first of all, I want to wrap up and release the Dragontooth Inn animatic, because that should get me another 2 or 3 creative busyness units. And then I think it's time to record and release a new Carl King full-length song album. Now, what does that mean? I'm talking about catchy, lyric-driven music, and maybe there will be a couple of cover songs, but we don't know yet. It would be material along the lines of, I'm an artist and I shouldn't have to work for a living, and showing more of my They Might Be Giants influence, like humorous subject matter with some well-written songs and plenty of real good musicianship bits. And I'll be sure to punch in a lot of non-lyrical genre-specific vocal sounds, whatever those are. Third, I would like to compose and record a 20th century classical music piece of some sort, and perhaps have it performed by some real musicians. So it would have to be a small ensemble of 4 or 5 people. I would definitely want a real pianist and a violinist, and hopefully a couple of vocalists. And maybe I would play some orchestral percussion and overdub various things. But I think I'd want it to be entirely acoustic. And by that, I mean no sequencing and no electronic instruments, if possible. All real mic'd instruments played by humans. But it's such a vague idea at this point, I really don't know what it could turn into. All I know is that genre of music is exciting to me, and that's kind of where I'm headed musically. And I'll expect to lose most of my creative busyness units on that one. And fourth, I would like to publish the So You're a Creative Genius, Now What? As a 2nd edition. And I've already had a brief meeting with my editor, Chris Higgins, about my intentions for it. And it seems like something I could knock out pretty quickly once I can set aside a chunk of time. And the purpose of that is simply to make minor updates and make the book officially available again. And I'm not sure how many creative busyness units a 2nd edition book is worth, but we're going to find out at this time next year. And fifth, Morgan Ogren's Conundrum, the 10th anniversary release in 4K. Can you believe it's already been 10 years? Well, I want to go back and clean up some of the coloring and exposure because I didn't really know what I was doing. I need to convert the frame rate correctly to 23.976, and then I want to get it onto streaming platforms like the Apple iTunes Movie Store or whatever it's now called. So be on the lookout for that. I have a feeling that that one will be a hit with the World Bureau for the Measurement of Creative Busyness and also Random Length Lumber. And finally, there is also a complicated metal album I've been wanting to make for a long time. At the very least, an EP. And we will see if there's time for that. But that's all I've got to report. So I want to thank everyone who has followed my work and encouraged me in my creative busyness, especially my very good friends of Carl King on Patreon, and I wish everyone a Happy New Year. Okay, that's the end of this episode of the Carl King Podcast. Remember to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, or anywhere else you listen to these dang podcasts. And support the creation of more episodes by joining my Patreon for $1 or $5 a month. That's patreon.com/Carl King. Or send a tip through PayPal or Venmo to username Carl Kingdom. And as always, special thanks to my $51 a month patrons at the Special Illusionist level, Chubode and Hank Howard III. And thank you to all of the very good friends of Carl King for listening. And as I always say, okay then, I will let everyone know.